funnily enough, a lot of that time doing nonfiction, analyzing shows and why they should work and how they should be produced and why X show is different from Y show. I mean, why is MasterChef different from Top Chef? Is a lot of the learnings that helps me analyze scripts today and pitch them today and understand how to sell them and why they should be made.
Got it.
Because eventually the two things that matter the most in picking a show is context and perspective. What is the context of making this? And what perspective are you using this in order for this to be made?
But it's such a pleasure to have you here. I've known you for like 3-4 years. We've worked together in the past. And I still remember before even I got a chance to interact with you, your reputation was like, it preceded so much. It's like, I'm sitting across somebody who's one of the kindest producers in the market, one of the most experienced executives in the market, and the kind of work that you've supported over the years. I'm going to let you take us through the kind of projects you've done. But to give a gist, this year has been a phenomenal year for you. You've had like 3 major releases, I believe Tooth Fairy and Trial by Fire. And then before that, you were working with Endemol where Arya had come out. And before the OTT advent happened, you were working on a lot of non-fiction projects like MasterChef, Big Boss and all, right? Let's start from the top. Let's start the day you stepped in Bombay. What were you feeling? How did your journey begin?
So I think anybody who isn't from Bombay, the moment they come here, they think, the future is theirs and things are just going to happen for you. And coming from Delhi, I must have been one amongst a million within my circle who wanted to sort of write. And at that point in time, I didn't even think of being a producer. I was very clearly keen to be a writer, and I just finished architecture. I had worked with my dad's firm for a while. I had done work as an associate producer at NDTV, and I got a job at Meditech as a writer for the writer's room on their Indian adaptation of Sesame Street.
Got it.
So when I come to Mumbai, it was with the dream that I would immediately start working on film, because that's what everyone dreams of. And I think I landed in Mumbai maybe in April, and for around 6 months I was looking for a job. Then around November, I literally went to Endemol on, I think, a Wednesday, and they were like, "You're hired, come from Monday." That really scared me.
Why did it scare you?
Because suddenly it was real, right? And Endemol at that time, someone had told me, it's going to sound like you're working for a pharmaceutical company, and it did, because I didn't know enough.
Okay.
I hadn't watched enough reality television. It hadn't sort of been part of my consciousness. So suddenly I'm in this place, which is possibly the biggest format owner. And I joined them the year after which they had just produced the first Big Brother in India. And I joined them as a script supervisor. And from there on, I just ended up working on many, many things. And I think my love for the company stems from the fact that I really grew up in that company.
You worked there for like 14 years or so.
I was there for 14 years, and I sort of managed to see the business from so many aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And, once in a while I'd question myself, because wanting to be a writer, what was I doing in reality television? But because I hadn't been to film school and things like that, work became my kind of learning ground. And I eventually was part of their development team, which was an incredible learning, because we were not only sort of adapting the existing formats, we were trying to make formats of our own. And then the best part was we were going out and pitching.
Got it.
Which I think is one of the biggest reasons why I moved from a purely creative standpoint to a slightly more business standpoint, because when you end up pitching to programming heads, you begin to realize so much about how they choose to see the world, what they want to produce, why they want to produce it. And that's when I realized that while I loved writing, the advantage I had was the ability to sell things on behalf of writers, and also learn how to protect it. The beauty of working in a production house is you learn how to do right by the project.
Yeah.
Whether it means fighting on budgets, whether it means fighting on timelines. You learn how to try and get the best out of the situation, and at the same time also give the client what they want. So I had a boss in the system who actually is possibly the person most responsible for getting me to move from writing into a more producerial role, Ankush Patel. And I had a lot of fun trying to envisage what was it I really wanted to do. Because at that point in time, you had only so many things you could be within the system.
Yeah. Can imagine.
You could either be a creative director, or you could be in production, or be a commercial person. And I actually wanted to be a combination of all those, which really didn't exist. So for a while, it seemed like I had taken a bit of a backseat. But yeah, I think for 10 years or so, I was only pitching nonfiction, watching a lot of nonfiction, coming up with ways and means to adapt something in order to make it a little more friendly for India and our audiences. And it was a lot of fun because, there's also such a huge gap within the many Indias that come on a platform like television. So you begin to understand a lot more about your own country.
Yeah, that's true.
Because I see it as a handicap having grown up in a Delhi and then a Bombay, where sometimes it's easy to think that this is all that exists, right?
Yeah.
But television is that one medium that goes across, as does streaming today, right? So it was always so insightful to have platforms come back with feedback, because they would have these copious amounts of analytics happening even at that time.
Yeah. Can you give an example of any particular insight that you might call?
It was something as simple as we must have been in 2010 or 11, and they were talking about the fact that even at that point in time, when a character on screen, a female character on screen, is asking for permission to study or to drive a car or the scooter in the house, it goes back to the fact that these are girls who till today, when they would go to the pharmacy to get, say, sanitary napkins, they would never be able to ask for it just like that. So, it gave you a lot of insight into the gap between the life we were living in Mumbai versus a lot of what was meant to be the life of girls our own age or younger than us living across different paths.
Got it. This is pre-internet. I'm guessing it was before 2010.
I think you mean pre-streaming.
Oh shit! Yeah.
I was there when internet came out.
No. I meant pre-Geo, like the Geo phenomena where everybody had a SIM card.
So let me sort of make it rather obvious. A friend of mine, Samar Khan, said something to me which made so much sense. He said, "Do you realize our generation has seen life from Doordarshan, where you used to get one movie at 5 p.m. and, the requisite amount of He-Man and Spider-Man on a Sunday, to then seeing satellite television and, having the TV 24/7 available, then to the explosion of the daily soap, and then finally streaming." So yes, I have seen it all, and it's amazing that you have seen that in the span of one lifetime.
Yeah,
It feels like, oh my God, it's 100 years, but it's not. It's actually...
It's barely 15 years, I think.
No, a little more than that. But yeah, I've, seen that across. And it's fascinating because I think technology, what it's done today, has sort of democratized what gets watched. And one of the biggest learnings I had was the belief for any television platform always was that the remote belonged to the man of the house for prime time. He'd come back home, he'd watch news, sports, and then eventually what the family would watch would be his choice.
Right.
And therefore, there was a specific time at which the woman would have the remote to herself, which was usually afternoon, evening when she was cooking. And there were amazing things that used to get told, like how in music shows, the choice of music also was that a lot of times when somebody was watching, they could also be multitasking and cooking. So the choice of songs should bring them to come watch what's on screen versus only being able to hear it. So, it was interesting to realize that so much of not just what you make, but how you make it and what time you put it on which time band, is dependent on your understanding of what your audience's aspirations are. Who do they want to watch? What are the kind of lives they want to lead? What are the kind of lives they want their children to see? And I think by the time we hit 2014, 2015, everyone was talking about how younger people were leaving television and moving towards their smartphones, which suddenly made the choice of content so much more independent. You could finally watch stuff where you didn't have to mute the love scenes. You could watch at the time you wanted to watch versus appointment viewing. I mean, my God, we heard so many terms which today get used in a slightly different manner.
Like what?
So at that time, there used to be engagement, which now has become subscriber engagement.
Oh, wow. Okay.
At that time, there used to be, this is appointment viewing versus snacky television. Snacky television.
What is the difference?
So appointment viewing is when you come at a specific time to watch something.
Okay, got it.
Versus snacky stuff is where you just put it on and you just watch it whenever it is on without necessarily following it.
Got it.
Unless you get hooked and then you try and come and match it to its viewing cycle.
I see.
And then, of course, understanding brands, what would bring advertisers to a particular show, etc., etc. So around 2012, 2014 was when I was very keen that we, as a company, we began to push a lot of our formats which existed outside of the non-fiction universe. And Mall used to have an incredible, and still does, an incredible library. I don't think a lot of people know that we are the producers of Peaky Blinders, Black Mirror, Broadchurch. But at that time, I think the concept of adaptation, and especially at the price point those things end up happening at, was a little difficult for television. And really,
how are the conversations like? Because these are very renowned formats globally, right? And then I'm guessing you're pitching these formats in India as adaptations.
Yeah.
So what were the conversations like?
I think everyone understood the potential of those adaptations. But I think what made them slightly more challenging was the fact that how would you justify the cost? And then a lot of times to justify the cost, you needed either talent or cast of a particular kind to make sure that you would be able to bring audiences to watch that. And the aim was also not to produce anything that would alienate an existing audience. And yes, sometimes I think it's important to keep in mind that if it ain't broke, why fix it?
Got it.
So if something is working for television, do you really want to reinvent to another level? And I must say, I think we saw a tremendous period of a lot of debate where there was the concept of should we do stuff on weekends, which is a little different and maybe what we can call a little more premium. So long story short, I think it took a while to arrive at a place before then suddenly streaming took over.
Right. And this is these conversations were happening before streaming took over.
Yeah.
I believe in those days, I think one of the premium shows that stand out in my head is 24. I think was adapted with Anil Kapoor.
Yeah.
So there were. Do you think there was a perceivable shift in what the consumers wanted, or how was the market reacting to it at that?
I think 24 was a great experiment, and it was actually done by someone I really enjoyed working with, Mr. Raj Nayak, who at that time was heading the Viacom network. And in fact, he later explained something to us which was so insightful. So 24 starts at night, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, not everyone had HD or 4K at home. So a lot of people didn't understand what was happening because the first 4 episodes until you head into sort of when the sun comes up was really dark, which was such a simple way of understanding how people were seeing something which you just assumed they would understand.
Right.
But I think it was a great attempt at pulling something off which was unusual. And I wish we could have done more of it, but then I think streaming eventually came in and did that for us.
Got it.
I think other than Ankush, the other person who I really owe a lot to in terms of helping me move in a particular direction is actually Ekta Kapoor.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because in 2016, she set up Alt, the platform. And Endemol ended up producing one of the first shows for her.
Test case.
The test case. And she showed so much confidence in me. And that actually made me realize, okay, this is what I really want to do, because it was a crazy but amazing experience.
Yeah.
Because, we were fundamentally a non-fiction company. So then to align the process towards producing fiction, working with outside talent, not having control over timelines, because non-fiction is to some extent formulaic.
Mm-hmm.
Across the process of production, you're going to shoot an episode on these particular days.
Yeah.
By then a run order will be ready, from which the anchor links will be ready. And all the ingredients that are going to appear on the day of the tech check and then finally on the day of the shoot.
Got it.
With fiction, anything can happen. Not to mention, it's a domino effect. If your writing isn't done, then how do you go into prep? And if you don't get enough time for prep, something or the other is going to go wrong on shoot.
Sorry, I have a question there. You spent so much time working on nonfiction, and you were hired as a script supervisor back in
Yeah.
And then from there, you started developing formats that you would pitch around in India, right? A lot of questions on that front, right? How does nonfiction have a script supervisor?
I saw it and I was script supervisor for one event. That was the first event I did. I saw it fundamentally like a human spell check.
Okay.
And I must say, at that time, I also didn't know what development meant.
Got it.
We had this very sort of glamorous term as think tank, where we used to watch a lot of stuff and give our opinion on it. And I think half the time I didn't know enough to give an opinion on it. And I learned a lot from watching everyone around me, because the team I was working with had already produced the first Big Brother.
Right.
And they were all very young, bright, and wanting to go on and produce non-fiction. And I was hoping to be discovered as the next big thing as a writer, which didn't happen. But I began to also understand that when you began to consider a format as a product, it was very similar to what I'd learned in architecture, where I had to sell why this land had to be made into this particular building and how it would sustain itself, right? So I began to adopt all those learnings. And, in architecture, we have this feared thing called the Viva, which happens in your 4th and 5th year.
Okay.
Where you basically get roasted by a bunch of practicing architects who ask you questions about everything related to your project. So I just started to use that principle to go out and pitch. And to be fair, at that point in time, Deepak, who was running Endemol India, began to see that, okay, I could handle a pitch. And he said something to me which actually is something that I base how I enter any project into now. He said, when you're pitching something, please keep in mind you're not the hero of it. You're pitching not just an idea, but the talent that's going to make it. And I think as a producer, that's how I see what I do today. That my job is fundamentally to protect the people who have put their heart on paper, who are going to spend the next roughly 2 years writing something and then going out and shooting it. I like that. I like the fact that I can say or do things which they may not be able to. They may not be able to negotiate for the things that I can. And I like the fact that I'm able to create an environment where the best out of them comes out. So, funnily enough, a lot of that time doing nonfiction, analyzing shows and why they should work and how they should be produced and why X show is different from Y show. I mean, why is MasterChef different from Top Chef? Is a lot of the learnings that helps me analyze scripts today and pitch them today and understand how to sell them and why they should be made.
Got it.
Because eventually the two things that matter the most in picking a show is context and perspective. What is the context of making this? And what perspective are you using this in order for this to be made?
Yeah.
So,
can you give us an example, like something that you learned back in the day by working on nonfiction, which kind of applies today?
Yeah, so I think one of the toughest pitches we ever made was actually MasterChef.
Okay.
Reason being, when you look at it, food is food, right? And it's the same all over the world. But then someone gave me terrific insight. This was Ashish Golwarkar, who had been at Z and had really big hits with Dance India Dance, and he'd just come out to star. And he said something to me which I'll never forget. He said, please understand that the problem with MasterChef as is that it alienates the housewife at home. She doesn't have a mixer and a grinder and, you know, all those implements that you have. And you know how in MasterChef, they flambe something with that little fire thing and all that. And he's saying also they don't have a lot of the ingredients. And you don't want to alienate them by telling them that in order to watch this show, you got to spend 1,000 rupees more to buy stuff.
Right.
Which I thought was an incredible way of looking at the format versus me looking at, oh, look at the food and how they shot this and isn't it exciting and food is universal and global, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So a lot of work had to be done in terms of cuisine. Also, you know, a lot of people don't want to show non-veg being cut on screen. So how do you go around that? Do you want to remain vegetarian? How do you dress Indian food? Because, you know, roast chicken can still look pretty on camera. But Rajma Chawal looks kind of like dodgy, right?
Right.
So it made you consider so many things, which then you realize your brain starts to look at even when you look at ideas in any different format. One of the other pitches I really enjoyed making was Shark Tank.
Okay.
And, you know, my idea was that what could be more exciting than having a camera on when someone is trying to convince you to give them money. And I think at that point in time when we pitched it, it was ahead of its time. And now look at it. I mean, it's a sensation.
Yeah. So what was the reaction back in the day with Shark Tank?
We got shooed out of the room.
What? Really?
Yeah, because I think it was seen as a very Western concept. And how would you make it interesting from a regular reality television? And, you know, one, of course, is the fact that you have 5 sharks who have 5 very different personalities. And the second was that how would you incubate all those ideas? So I think the good thing of it happening right now is that, and also post-COVID, is that this is the generation of people wanting to go beyond the family business or wanting to take on a regular white-collar job. So those things make a big difference.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that at that time, casting would have been tougher.
This is pre the startup explosion that happened, is it?
I think we were talking Shark Tank in maybe 2015, 2016.
Oh, it's not that too long ago. Yeah.
It's not exactly BC.
No. It feels like a different world. I'm honestly telling
But
you.
it is.
Yeah.
It is. It's amazing how much the world has changed from, say, even 2016. From the time I watched, what was the first Netflix show we all were going gaga about? The Kevin Spacey one?
House of Cards.
House of Cards.
Yeah.
To now,
Yeah.
right? So,
It feels like the world is evolving so.
quantum shift.
Yeah, where we are today and where we started, it's such a
absolutely.
big. Yeah. Okay, fair enough.
Then after producing 2 shows with Ekta, we actually got offered Bombay Begums as the production arm.
Yeah, this was, and it came out very recently, right? Like there's a.
It came out in 2020, I think.
2020, yeah.
Or 2021.
Yeah. It's not been too long, but we're talking like 2016 since you started talking about it?
No, I think we started work on it in 2019.
Oh, you started work on it 2019. Got it. Okay.
And that was a totally different way of working because Netflix is extremely organized. It has processes. And, you know, you have to abide by a bunch of things.
Yeah.
But
Let's actually talk about that for a bit, right? Because I feel like there has been a rise of corporate studios and corporates in the last 10, 15 years in India, right? Before that, it was a lot more traditional in its operations, right? So how do you see the differences shape up in different companies that you've worked with, right? Some, say, companies like Alt Balaji, which are homegrown versus, say, a company like Netflix. which came here from the West, right? So what are the differences that you've seen from just an operation and processes standpoint?
Well, I think the fundamental difference is when you work with somebody like Ekta, then you know she's taking the calls.
Got it.
And there's a comfort to that because then you attune yourself to thinking how she would think. And during the process of the show, then you decide what are the things you agree with and what are the things you're willing to fight for. And to be fair to her, if you put up a good enough argument, she agrees. I think with a Netflix, because they are also corporate and that decisions are not always individual to specifically even the show.
Right.
They're also dealing with certain diktats that they are getting. So it's not always that easy to understand where they're coming from. I think the culture of feedback always existed. It's something that is a legacy even from television. That whatever you pitched, there would be an X number of people having a say on it. Which is, it is what it is. It's fun. Let me put it that way. Because sometimes even if you don't agree with it, you'd laugh about it. But then when the show goes on air and you see the response, you realize where they are coming from. But I think there's always a good and bad to every change that happens.
Yep.
And I think we are a generation that is seeing the start of many things, which is why our reaction to a lot of things are like, I don't want to do this. And I think maybe 5 years from now, everyone will be working in exactly the way that a Netflix, Amazon works.
Right.
Where it's far more streamlined.
Just to understand like this a little more, I would assume that a Netflix and Amazon and the bigger corporates have far more people working in different teams across different teams.
Yes, you need to work with their specific teams.
Right.
Though technically that existed even in television. It's just that at that point in time, television did function with a certain amount of chaos, which was always seen as the X factor for bringing out the magic in something because, we've been in situations where we've been told to turn around something in 40 days.
Wow, okay.
Right? But today with the quality control any of these streaming platforms have, that's not possible, especially not in scripted. And then you also get to know that you have to upgrade yourself because they all have a X amount of technology that you need to adhere to. You know that you're going to be compared to shows not just from the country but other parts of the world. And the fact that you are possibly basing your feedback not just on an Indian but maybe a global audience or at least a Southeast East Asian audience. So it was fun. And like I said, we were fundamentally a non-fiction company. So having to take into account the fact that a project could run on the books for like 18 months.
Wow.
Took a while to get used to. Or to know that writers were important. So, in non-fiction, what is the writer's job, right? Anchor links, certain amount of sort of structuring of a task or a scene. But you move into another format within the same realm of entertainment where until the writer's job is not done, you can't even budget or schedule.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of rejigging in all our heads on how to just work with that and appreciate it for what it is.
Got it. Fair. So I have to ask you a question, This is something that it's coming from a very personal space. Whenever I watch non-fiction reality shows, somehow, somewhere or the other, I'm thinking, hey, this can't be coincidence. This can't be like happening on the spot. There's somebody feeding something to these guys to say what they're saying, because it's just so dramatic and so spot on in those moments. You don't have to take names. What is the reality there? Like, how are non-fiction reality shows so incidentally dramatic?
I think, and I'm not being politically correct, I'm actually being honest. Non-fiction fundamentally works on the principle of psychology.
Got it.
Right? And while both scripted and non-scripted have the same principles, it just sort of plays out differently. Very much like how you check with the writer about who is this character, what is his motivation, why would he do this, what's the conflict. From the very time you begin casting, you begin to pick people based on what you're hoping from them. And, especially when the Big Boss team used to do casting, it used to be down to a psychological breakdown, which is actually fascinating because you're picking people based on the fact that how you think they're going to react across the period of 100 days. Similarly, I think when we would be producing something which was, say, for an MTV or, producing something even as a song and dance show, of course, there was the underlying need for a certain amount of talent in order to be a singer or a dancer. But just to sort of, how would they react if they got told this or if their partner was switched? I think all the creative directors had to think a lot in terms of who these people were, spend time listening to them, seeing them react.
Got it.
And the learning from nonfiction really is you have plan A, B, C, D all the way.
Oh, really?
You have to.
Got it.
Because, there is a sort of moral code you have to adhere to. You can't sort of tinker with the petri dish. But yeah, you just plan and make sure that one of those darts you're throwing is going to hit a mark.
That's true.
And then, of course, there's always the edit that, what you see would have maybe been the sixth take. It took a while to arrive at that point.
Fair. So any particular, incident you remember where plan A, B, C did not work and you had to really think on the spot and get that?
So thankfully, with nonfiction, I didn't produce that much.
Got it.
I basically developed.
Okay.
And I pitched. And I made sure that whatever kind of support that the teams needed would be there. It's really with scripted that I then went on to produce actively.
Okay, fair enough.
Because at that point in time, the bulk of talent and the most senior talent was all on nonfiction. And I just sort of got this fait accompli sort of scenario on this show.
Mm-hmm.
And I took to it like a fish to water.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's fun. So now let's go back to Bombay Begums, right? After that, what? How is that process and how did that shift?
So I think after Bombay Begums, so Bombay Begums was really interesting because it also taught you how to work not just with the Netflix, but someone like an Alankrita who was very disciplined about what she had wanted from the show, how she envisaged it, who did she want for casting, etc., etc. And then our understanding of also how to maybe be a little bolder as producers and sort of stand by what was needed by the show. Because in television, I think as a production house, you're far more user-friendly for the platform. And also nonfiction allows you, it's a sort of Jenga thing where if you take something out from here, you can sort of plug it.
Got it.
While in scripted, you can't.
Right.
There is a process. So that was a huge learning curve. And then I think while Begums was in production, we sort of, at that point in time, I was working with a lovely gentleman called Abhishek Rege. And, the aim was also how to rebrand Endemol as a production partner for scripted versus only being someone who had sort of conquered the nonfiction space. So with his support, we ended up developing a lot. So that's when I was actively meeting you far more often.
Right.
Because there were writer-director combos who had developed Bibles or pilots or story ideas.
Yeah.
At that time, we began to pick up a lot of book rights, of which one turned out to be Trial by Fire.
Yeah.
So there was a huge amount of sort of investment being made into creating a pipeline from which we would then hopefully bombard the market and work with more and more streaming platforms.
So it took a while, right? I think that was 2019 onwards till...
So 2019 and 2020, and I think because 2020 was fundamentally COVID, we ended up doing a lot of development, which was a lot of fun. But it was also frustrating because I think development is such a emotional process. And
this is coming from somebody who is producing this, right? Somebody who is sitting on the other side, right? I'm very fascinated to hear because you've been a writer and you're now producing. So please elaborate on what do you mean it's an emotional process from your perspective today?
So it's an emotional process because, you're working very, very closely with the writer, showrunner, director. And you're also basing a lot of your feedback on how you think or what you think the show is.
Got it.
And the platform is yet to come.
Yep.
And a lot of times, the thing is, well, if you don't like it, that's fine, but let the platform come and decide. Which is also true, that eventually if they're the guys paying for something, then let them take the call on how do they see the show.
Yep.
And I think as a producer, sometimes, because to some extent you have more objectivity than the other couple of parties, you have to be truest to the project and try and see it to the best of its ability, even though it might reach a point where it's going to become a problem for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that the cost of a show is going to make it or take it to a value commercially. That's going to be an uphill battle for you, right? But then you also realize you have to be true to it and make sure you get it.
Yeah.
There's no other way of doing this. Of course, there's always a way of cutting stuff and making it lesser. But the first port of call is always try and do the best and get the max which you think the show deserves. Also, sometimes during development, you start pitching the idea around and you don't exactly get the kind of feedback or response that you want. And it's heartbreaking because you're the one who has to speak to the writer, director and explain. So yeah, it does become emotional because you spend that much time with somebody, right? And it's also frustrating for everyone. You're reading the same script maybe 5-6 times. They're rewriting it 5-6 times. You're arguing. I think sometimes the best relationships are the ones in which you can argue with someone full force, but you're arguing about the job and it's not personal.
Right.
Which also takes a lot of training.
Yeah, it does, isn't it?
And then also when you start developing with someone, it's a very sort of intensive relationship for a year, 18 months or whatever. So you can't not become friends. Right?
That's so true.
And
Yeah.
you can't not become involved in the fact that, dude, today I fell ill, I didn't feel like working, kya mere ko ending aa hi nahi raha, main kya karu? So, you really have to think of ways to sort of nudge them. It's like having babies in some ways.
Yeah, no, that's so true, right? And this is one of the things that really, when I remember when we were sitting across a conversation and there's a project that you had read. It was about 800, 900 odd pages and you read every single one of them. And I think it was an hour, 90-minute long conversation where you really, kind of reiterated what the project was about, what you interpreted, what you liked, what you didn't like. And I was just listening in and I was like, if I am on the other side as a writer, this probably is one of the best conversations any writer has had, because you were so gentle with your feedback. You were so kind. Which I think goes on to show the kind of relationships that one can develop.
But that's also because I loved Milan, because I had just seen Mera Sunday and I had really wanted to work with him. And while reading what he had sent, while I was enjoying it, I was also aware of the fact that, dude, this is ahead of its time, And that's equally heartbreaking because sometimes you've got to give feedback which may not be entirely yours. I mean, had I had the money, I would have loved to have made the show on my own.
Right.
But I also had to see it from the perspective of a business.
Right.
And, me representing a company which was, at that point anyway, on so many of the things I'd chosen, we kept getting told, oh, this is a little too cool and, that kind of stuff.
Got it.
So that was very, very heartbreaking because I saw the merit in it.
Yeah.
But I also saw the fact that I don't think we were ready to produce it.
No, that's understandable, right? I think that's also part of the game, right? Where you are with your company at that point, you can't produce everything that you like, right? But which brings me to the fundamental question that comes to me a lot of times, right? When I'm talking to different writers, I'm telling you, there are like so many sidebars writers have when you're sitting across at some bar and discussing, you know what, we went to this platform and the producer and the executive did not get at all what we were trying to do. And it is a really frustrating conversation to even hear about, because sometimes the writer is coming with a very strong vision, a very, strong idea about what they want to do. But then sometimes the executives on the other side, they are coming at it from a very different perspective, They are coming at it from a different vision altogether, which is not aligning. Now, sure, it takes a little bit of back and forth to sometimes land on what works and what doesn't. But that begs the question, because this world of corporate studios working at Netflix Prime, they're relatively new career fields, right? What do you think, in your opinion, makes for a good executive? Say somebody starting out they've passed out from a college, BMM or some other field, and they want to enter this corporate side of media. What are the things that you want to convey to them would make for a good that they could make for a good executive?
So I don't think anyone particularly decides to be an executive. I think it's something that ends up happening.
Okay.
And I think everybody who comes into this profession honestly has a dream of being very closely attached to whatever's happening either in front or behind the camera, right?
Right.
I mean, before I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be an actor, right? And somewhere we all fall in love with that as the first thing we see.
Right.
And then from then on, we sort of become a lot more streamlined about our love affair with narrative and storytelling. But I think for executives today, especially if you're starting out and you find yourself in a corporate job, the bigger question is, what are you there for? Are you there to sort of learn more about the profession? Because it's a great learning ground. You begin to work with people and enter rooms where decisions of how to spend money are being spoken of, which I think is such an important learning to have. You're also getting exposure to how an international company thinks. And you're getting an understanding of how the business is seen, because while it is a business, it does stem from an art form. So somewhere you're getting exposed to that balance, however lopsided you might think it would be. And I think the important thing is, do you want to be a career executive? Because that's also okay. Or are you there for a certain time period? Once you've decided that, then depending on what it is you really want to do, you have to start aligning yourself to what is the kind of content you want to produce. What do you think works for the platform? Because unfortunately, you're part of a bigger whole. And I think some people are lucky where they can superimpose their individuality onto the company, aesthetically, creatively. Like, I think Sabir Nair and Star are always synonymous for giving us KBC and Kyuki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi, right? That's a supreme combination of an executive being able to align his vision with what was needed from the company at that point in time.
Yeah.
But that's a once-in-a-lifetime approach. So you have to constantly keep thinking of, even if you get a very specific diktat of what the company would want to produce, what is the best you can do with that?
Got it.
And I would also say, start reading. I think one of the things that I feel really bad about is that writers and directors get judged on the power of narration, which technically is not what they're meant to do. There's no rule book that says that a writer has to be a great narrator or editor. In fact, I think most writers are socially awkward introverts, and hence they've chosen the profession they have.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we miss the magic of what was on paper because it was a shitty narration, or the person wasn't able to narrate an idea. And not every idea is easy to narrate. I mean, I can't imagine Christopher Nolan being able to narrate Tenet to anyone, right? He must have said, read it, then if you understand it, then we'll talk.
Right.
Or even Oppenheimer. I mean, you look at it, I mean, how would you possibly tell someone that this is what I intend to do with the film?
Yeah.
So, and the other thing I would say is, wherever you can, try and bring a bit of what you believe about the world into that conversation. I think the beauty of working in a multi-generational team today is the fact that when I was starting out, I wasn't always that comfortable to voice my opinion. Today, I think the executives joining are very, very open about saying, I don't like this, I don't like that. And I think being part of a corporate makes you understand that even when you do voice your opinion, it has to be supported by stuff. Uh,
Supported by?
Statistics,
Yeah.
research,
Yeah.
and it just can't be that, oh, I like it.
Right.
It has to be like, why do you like it? Why do you think it works, etc.
Yeah.
Um,
And given the world that we live in, where you may be on the other side of receiving bad information, which is through Instagram or whatever. Like, say, I'm a young executive, and I've been reading about something lost in my echo chamber, which may not be factually accurate. And I show up on my work day, and I'm voicing that opinion, which is not backed up by real statistics out there.
Absolutely. I think, in fact, today more so, everything that we're showing or the stories that we want to tell come from so many different perspectives which we may not be exposed to. So it's our job to actually find out if it's accurate or not, or why it's relevant.
Yeah.
You know?
Is there a particular moment that you recall, or an incident, just to understand how this plays out in a real life situation where you have somebody young in the team who's mustering up the courage to speak up about something they believe in, but given the experience that you carry, you felt like, maybe they need to go back and do their homework. Is there any situation that did part?
I have a very sweet experience of a gentleman I'm working with today. And I remember we were supposed to do something which was like a historical reconnaissance of India's history.
Okay.
And all the chapters was meant to be Mohenjo-daro. And he looked at me and said, the movie, right? And I said, no, the civilization. For 2 minutes, he was like, I said, you do realize the movie is based on a civilization. Said, really? And I was like, oh, okay. Like. So, of course, those things happen. But I think the scary and beautiful part about the industry we're in is a good idea can come from anyone at any point in time.
That's true.
And seniority offers experience. It may not always offer genius.
Right.
And that's the shitty part, right? You could have been sitting in a chair for 20 odd years and there'll be some young kid who'll say something and it's up to you to realize, shit, that's a really smart thing he or she said.
Yeah.
So it's important to hear everyone. And especially since we're catering to an audience which is leaning on a particular side of chronology, right? You're supposed to be sitting on the world's largest 25 or under 25 audience, which, as you have already told me a couple of times, I passed many years ago. So it does help to just be open to what's around you. And I think the other thing about producing in India is there's so many Indias. And like I said, my drawback is I've grown up in a Delhi and a Mumbai. I haven't seen as much as I would love to. And sometimes that happens through stories that they just blow your mind because they're set in a different town and a different dialect with characters you sort of instinctively know, but you may not have ever met, with motivations which you can understand, but you've never grown up around, right?
Yeah.
And that becomes beautiful, that then you say, I want to show this because there'll be so many people like me who are not aware of this.
That's true. That's so true. And that actually brings me to another question. Now you're serving as a VP and content head at Lionsgate, right? So you're at the top of the pyramid when it comes to greenlighting projects and, setting up projects for the market. Now, as you said, there are multiple Indias. The India is different from where you are looking at it from, right? Given that we are in the world of the internet where different people can watch whatever they want, it's not like, okay, we have got a 9 p.m. slot on television. Different viewers are watching different things. It's a lot more fragmented from a viewership perspective as well. Do you feel there's an opportunity to tell very unique and specific stories that may not potentially resonate with, say, a blanket audience, but will resonate with a slight, a smaller fragmented audience right now, versus, going at or coming at it from a rather universal angle where, okay, no, we need to look at the lowest common denominator as an audience and write something that's, say, supposedly massy and then go with that? Where do you think lies an opportunity in today's time?
But we were earlier talking about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah,
And to me, that's what streaming has done.
got it.
Firstly, in terms of languages, I think the subtitle has freed us from only having to consume content in Hindi or English. And I think that's the biggest legacy of streaming for me. The second is the fact that because of streaming, we've been introduced to wonderful talent which otherwise was sidelined in film.
Right.
And from across the world, that you get introduced to a Wagner Moura who you never even heard of, and then suddenly for like 3 years, he's Pablo Escobar for you, right? I believe, and this is purely personal, is that streaming works because there is diversity and that people find their content. Yes, there will be certain shows that are anomalies that within being so specific to where they come from, they resonate across. And that's the power of either the character or the world. You can see that, say, with a Money Heist or anything that's become a global hit, right? But I also think there are things that work because they're so specific and they find audiences which will surprise you despite being so specific. And I think somewhere along the way that balance has to be retained.
That's true.
As opposed to thinking everything should be 100% massy. It's important to have, if you're producing 10 shows a year, then maybe 6 can be the ones which are going to be for the mass. And the other 4 are the ones that constantly push the envelope. Because also, you're not only creating content for today. You greenlight something today, it's going to drop 2 years from now. Will it match the ethos in those 2 years? And you might say, well, Mrinalini, what happens in 2 years? But we're sitting at a point where 2020 seems like years ago.
Yeah, it does it?
Right? And in content, even far more, because the relevance of an idea is so very important. And a lot of times you have to look at it from that perspective, that by the time the show gets made, where is it going to sit and how is the world going to view it? And which is why I think it's important to constantly keep balancing between that mass and sort of niche debate, which I think has been time immemorial. I've been hearing that from the time of television, which was such a mass audience. And the dream from streaming was that it would allow for a little more niche. And which is why, people like me gravitated towards it who hadn't had any sort of exposure to film and came from TV, and hence this was supposed to be a place where we could actually produce what we wanted to.
Right. So it gave you that opportunity in this today's time.
Yes.
Yeah.
To some extent, absolutely. To some extent, that argument still exists. That is this massy enough?
Fair.
And I think that's going to be there for a while until somewhere we become a little more either aware of where India is going. Because I think today, if someone is consuming something with the subtitles, then they don't necessarily need everything dumbed down.
Right.
And I also feel if all the empirical data is about massy stuff doing well because all we're producing is massy stuff, then it doesn't really support the argument if something different won't work at all.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? And so this also brings me to an interesting perspective that I would like you to just talk about a little more. Is that you have climbed up the pyramid in terms of now not only looking at writers pitching to you, at producers pitching to you in terms of the shows that they believe in, but you're also privy to the data points that are coming across from the business and the tech teams that you're working with, right? How does that factor in your decision making? What are you looking at when you're looking at both sides?
Well, of course, it factors in terms of the fact that certain things will always get a lot more attention. But having said that, it also means that what if we tried something else in this space? When a show becomes a hit, does it only become a hit because it's specifically that show or because it touches certain points?
Right.
And can those points also be touched across in another series and in another manner? I think that constant evolution is what is important. And I think that's going to happen now, because we weren't allowed a lot of that earlier, because television worked on such a strict commercial formula that the parameters for producing were already ordained. But today with scripted, yes, of course, no one wants to waste money by just having a budget the size of a small country for the sake of it. But there are ways and means to sort of tell a story differently while still not breaking the bank. And that evolution is very important for us, especially for writers and directors, because you already have one medium that is so specific because you have to produce in a certain amount. And then you have another medium which is decided because the box office dictates what's going to work. And that is also a mythology which no one has been able to crack. You just hope that you crack it. So somewhere along the way, streaming is meant to be the place where that experimentation is allowed, as long as it's within certain commercial parameters which are not as strict as television.
Got it.
Because in television, the whole point of the daily soap was that you're producing at such a clear number.
Yep.
And within an X amount of time, that there was only so much you could do in those 22 minutes and still make it work.
Yeah, that's so true.
So, I think somewhere along the way, the balance is really going to be between how much of the business has to always hit the bullseye and how much of the business should be allowed to do a certain amount of R&D. And yes, it's easy for me to say because it's not my money. But I think that's the unfortunate part of this profession, that until you don't keep questioning and trying new stuff, you'll never arrive at what's the next big thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? I think it kind of gives a lot of confidence. Like, being a writer on the other side, it gives me a lot of confidence to hear this from someone like you, because now at least I can be like, okay, there are people willing to hear you out.
Yeah, they may not have the money, but they're willing to hear you out.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's really a unique world that we live in, which also reminds me, where do you think the OTT industry is headed, in terms of content and the creative stand that we have today versus the next 3-4 years or 5 years from now?
So, a couple of weeks ago, for the first time, apparently, network viewing was below 50% in the US.
Okay.
And for the first time, I think they were at a 49% and streaming was at 51%. And also the past couple of months and weeks we've had, cinemas are back. I think both streaming and theater will always remain streaming, because it's not just about content, it's a lifestyle shift.
Yeah.
Today, because of the way we live and the pace at which we live, we're never going to go back to watching something at 9 a.m. in the morning or 9 p.m. at night. And I think binge viewing has become a bit of a culture, right? And I also feel that the experience of watching a film with 100-odd people is like communal prayer. You can't take it out of our blood. So both are there. What I hope is that streaming continues to allow for more voices. I think, coming back to that point of inclusion and diversity, I think there's a lot of talent in this country which has been waiting for this opportunity.
Yeah.
And the beauty of living and breathing in a developing country is that your daily life makes you so observant. Your daily challenges make you so empathetic or angry. And you develop a sense of humor because very little of your life is really in your control. And I think those kind of voices need more and more platforms, and which is why I think we're going to see a lot more coming out of countries which till now you didn't even realize had a culture of storytelling. And I hope streaming does that, because it's going to take a while before the box office does. the belief that only big movies with big faces are going to do well, is going to mean that my favorite, which was the mid-level film, is really going to have to put up a fight in order to shine.
Right.
And if it only finds a home on streaming, then streaming will have to be a little more generous and maybe just a little more pro-risk to allow for different stories. And that's my hope. And I understand that everyone sort of is working under market forces and data and analytics. But I refuse to believe that today, after having gone through a pandemic and having gone through so many societal and cultural changes, that people are not hungry to see something different or to see something that they haven't seen before.
Yeah. No, that's true. And okay, so there's one perspective about films and streaming, where streaming brings more opportunity to tell different kind of stories. And like you said, we hope that happens. But then streaming is also happening generally on the same device as a phone, right? Which is competing with
Short form.
Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts and all, right? So what is your view or insight on, are they competing for the same viewership, or how are they placed in different for your audiences really?
So, I come from a generation where short form content is something you do while you're sitting on the pot.
Got it.
Or while you're in your Uber, or when you're waiting for someone to come for a meeting. But I understand there is a generation that's grown up on it. And it's very easy to lose 2 hours just going through Insta Reels. But I feel the magic of storytelling versus Reels, it's like comparing maybe tiramisu to a bar of Cadbury's chocolate.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? You enjoy both.
Yeah.
There's a time and place.
Right.
And I think that sense of occasion does happen when it comes to long form. I mean, no one said Instagram Reel and chill, right? They said Netflix and chill for a reason. And yes, of course, you're always competing. I think YouTube Shorts are still number one in terms of consumption. But do they transport you to a different world? Do they give you emotional support on that day when you don't want to go out? Or do they make you laugh when you had a shitty day at work? Maybe they do a little, but not as much as, watching a rom-com or stuff like that. So I think that magic will never go. Yes, I think the challenge is the maths of the same person having only 24 hours in a day. And what are they going to choose to watch when they have both? And I think that just pushes us to make more and more compelling content. There's no escaping that. There's no... it's not like when we used to get told that, listen, it's a 100-mark paper, but this question is for 30 marks. So if you answer this, then you just need to answer one more and you will pass. That concept of passing no longer exists. You have to sort of excel. And that excel means not necessarily always being short about delivering a hit, but at least being sure that whatever you've produced is the best that it can be. And that's up to us.
Fair. And I was reading about this somewhere where these short form reels, they have like a 3-second to 5-second window where either they grip your right, or you swipe away. Now, if they, like you said, there's a generation that's grown up on this, right? So their brains potentially are wired to that kind of hooks, those kind of hooks, which the long form is actually away from, right? And generally speaking, right, where it takes a bit of time to get to the hook, right? You have to spend those minutes before you see that first gripping beat, right? With pulls you into the world. Now, from a development standpoint, do you find yourself sitting across conversations where you're telling a writer to, bring the hook point, much closer to the 0-second mark? Or
yes and no. I think it depends also to do with the show. There's unfortunately no one size fits all.
Got it.
And I think that is the biggest challenge we have, where while there are certain diktats you wish you could have across all the content you produce, but there's also specificity based on what you're producing and how it should be.
Right.
Can it always be a hook point which is next to The 0 second, maybe not, but can it be an opening that grabs you in a different way? Yes. And that's definitely an endeavor, because I'd be a fool to think that we aren't competing across not just short form, but just so much content today.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a show being dropped every weekend, somewhere or the other, right? And there are movies galore dropping on every day of the week. So, but that also again comes back to what is eventually on paper. I think the core of everything that we choose to do in scripted, whether film or series, whether we like it or not, comes down to what's on paper. And that has to be of the biggest importance to us before we get down to cast and X and Y. And I think streaming is forcing us to take what's written far more seriously than we've ever had to. Both on, especially in our films, on our soaps.
Yeah.
Because we're up against a very tough crowd now.
Yeah.
And we're also being compared to not just another show on another platform, but another show from another country. Which is why it is tough, and which is why people take so long to decide should they greenlight this or not.
That's so true. Now, it all boils down to the writing of it, right? How the writers are able to, get that across in a very efficient manner, but also in a very creative manner, right? In today's world where we have so much content thrown at us, right? But given that there are conversations happening around AI, what do you think the world will look like in the next 5 years in terms of writing and AI?
I'd love to say I know for a fact what's going to happen. I don't. But I also feel that there will always be someone who will bring you something that's written by AI, or, you just try it out for a lark, or it helps you out where, you're stuck. But the magic of someone pouring their heart out onto paper. And why I like reading a script so much is what writers and directors don't get is when you're reading what they've written, you get to know them.
Right.
Without having spent time with them, you get to know how they feel, how they think. Because somewhere along the way, you've put in an argument where you've taken a side.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the way, you've put in a perspective which I don't think AI could do, at least not at this stage. And I think the empathy that you get in something well written, even if it's a genre where you least expect empathy, is unmatchable.
That's true. Now let's make this a little speculative, okay? And say there is a script that comes across to you, which is exactly how you described it. You read it, you felt like you're reading a person's heart, you get an insight into who they are, but turns out it's not written by a real human being. What does that make you feel?
Along with stupid. Hey, I mean, the scary part is I can't say no. If something comes across which is of a particular quality and it has not been written by a human being,
Yeah.
then I'll have to eat my words. It's the choice.
No, it's scary and it's interesting at the same time.
It's also mind-boggling because, that means something is being able to mimic emotion in a manner.
Yeah.
Because what I'm really banking on is human emotion.
Right.
You might have the skill, you might know you might have the algorithm of high points and low points down to an art form.
Mm-hmm.
But can you mimic subtlety and emotion? If you can, dude.
It'll be crazy to see if that happens, though.
Yeah?
Yeah. Now, let's come back to the present. What do you look for in a script or a pitch that comes across to you when you're reading it, right? Like, in simple words, if a writer is listening to this conversation, what would you tell them?
I've said this many times, so it's at the cost of repeating myself. I look for a voice. I look for someone who's saying something that I might have heard before, but they're saying it in a manner that I've never heard it before. I look for a certain amount of individuality. I look for a certain amount of vulnerability. And I I look for someone who is willing to expose themselves. Um, and I think what we're looking for today, especially in a country like us, which is so complex in so many ways and yet so simple, is somebody who sort of captures the spirit of contemporary India. And I don't mean that necessarily set a character in Bandra or South Delhi or Bangalore, but somewhere just catch the spirit of what's happening today, where we are so much delicious khichdi of so many things,
Yeah.
and stories that showcase that to me in whichever genre, whether it's even horror, is so interesting that someone represents the authenticity of where they come from in a manner which is, and that also leads me to love scripts that are multilingual, because being an Indian, you easily, though languages too are given, it's not unusual to have someone who speaks in 4 languages and hence can express themselves across a multitude of emotions in many different ways. But I really look for that individuality, whether it's in the choice of character, whether it's in the choice of what the story is about. And while that may not always mean a commission immediately, it makes the writer stand out in my mind.
You got it. And then you can go back to the front.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, this is on the creative side of things, right? You have worked across the board in different roles, whether you were a script supervisor to now, greenlighting projects. What are the soft skills, in your opinion, that a writer should have today?
I think the biggest skill, and I won't call it soft because that's unfortunately the nature of the business, is the ability to collaborate. And collaboration is not just about including someone's feedback into your script. It's really about, writing is beautiful when you're sitting in a scenic place like this, but eventually it's going to be shared with people who are going to have to say some stuff about it, which isn't always nice. Then if it gets greenlit, it's going to be shared with another 15, 20 HODs who will always have a point of view and sometimes even bring up some stuff which is very, very valid. And collaboration fundamentally stems from the point of wanting to get something made and realizing that you can't make it alone. And then from the fact that everyone is going to have an opinion about what you've written and what you've dreamt of. And no matter how intimate that experience was of writing it, it is going to be exposed and spoken about by a bunch of people.
Right.
Including somebody who's eventually going to act out that part. And that spirit of collaboration doesn't only stem from the fact that, hey, I'm okay working with you. That spirit of collaboration comes from a sense of innate security. And yes, as a producer, it's my job to make you feel secure, especially in terms of credits, which are so, so important. Then in terms of your monetary gain, which is also important. But the third has to come from you, which is my place in this is not governed by how much I fight to stick to my point, but how much I'm able to explain where I'm coming from and then collaborate in order to make something better. And that's a very human thing because unfortunately, one aspect of writing is very, very isolated. And there's a second equally big aspect of writing, which is very, very people extensive.
Yeah, it is.
And somewhere you need to find your balance in that. And that unfortunately comes from a sense of security only you can have. And a sense of confidence. And I think a lot of it is also based on us because while we keep saying writers have become so expensive, I think we also have to work a little harder in making writers feel comfortable and secure. It's only now I feel that they've been getting their due and we're still thinking about the 20 or 30 odd writers who are earning at a particular level.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of them out there who've been gypped or who've had their idea taken or who've done stuff for free.
Yeah. And the whole WGA strike that's happening right now speaks to, like, yeah, it's sure there are a few writers who are getting their fair due, but there are so many of them who aren't.
Don't.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be understood. And I'm really, really amazed at the quality of solidarity that's come out for them.
Yep.
And I hope one day we can do that too, because, you can't forget everything in our business starts from what was written on paper. And I love the fact that we're in a profession that when we decide to do a project, there are 200, 300 people who get employed. But all of that began because someone wrote out 100 pages of something. And while they might have written it with the support of a director or a producer, they wrote it out. And I think to me, that is the first thing that will help us evolve into an even stronger industry, is if we value what's on paper first and maybe make that the priority before we start taking in a lot of other feedback.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of, okay, there's one world of writers and then there's your world, right? Just to understand from what your day-to-day looks like, would you be comfortable just sharing what an average workday looks like for you as an executive?
So it's a combination of things. And what I love about my job is I don't just wear one hat at a time. During the course of a day, you could be having a very detailed discussion about a story or a synopsis or even a screenplay. You could have an equally detailed discussion about how you think an edit is going ahead, or speak to somebody about a brief on BGM and things like that. But at the same time, you're also arguing over scheduling, budgets. You get pulled into a marketing meeting, which makes you think even more, because that's not something I've done before. And that's one of the first things I was exposed to here, which was really interesting. It was really insightful. But it's that constant juggling between various roles that I really find interesting, because it also makes me feel that I'm very, very involved in something, as opposed to only coming from the perspective, like in nonfiction, of only having developed the idea and then it went on to be produced by somebody else. So I enjoy that. A large part of my day is basically talking to people, communicating stuff, getting them to do it. But I choose to think that a large part of my job is getting the best out of people. There's a certain amount of fighting involved, which could be with any point, because I think as a producer, your first priority is what is best for the show or the film. And then you could be fighting with your own team or with the director or the writer.
Fair. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This has been great. I'm going to ask you one last question before we wrap this. What are you watching these days and why?
So the most recent thing I watched, which was recommended to me by two people, was an Australian series called Fisk.
Okay.
I really enjoyed that. Irreverent humor, which is so difficult to pull off. Then I have certain favorites which I keep coming back to. So I'm on Only Murders in the Building season 3.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
I also have a guilty pleasure of The Wheel of Time, because I have a huge thing for fantasy and anything that's related to fantasy. Then what else? I always end up catching a couple of movies which I've missed out on. I have some rom-coms which I always go back to, just because they're comfort food for me. And then on our own platform, I just finished a series called Starstruck season 3, where it is a dystopian world because the superhero is a gentleman called Tom Kapoor. But it's a lovely little rom-com written by a stand-up comedian. So yeah, a bunch of stuff. I also recently watched a series that I really enjoyed on BBC called This Is Gonna Hurt.
This is gonna hurt. Okay.
It has Ben Winshaw, the guy who's Q from the Bond movies.
Okay.
So there's a bunch of stuff. I also try and be a little more disciplined and watch things with a lot of subtitling. But then you can't write emails while watching it.
Fair.
So yeah.
That's amazing. On that note, thank you so much, Mrinalini.
Thank you so much for having me.
It has been such a pleasure. And for our listeners, we hope you enjoyed the conversation. And if you like what you hear, consider supporting us. There's a Patreon link in the description. It would mean a lot for us if you could, just contribute whatever you can and let us keep this going. Thank you.
Thank you.